Alright, in this tutorial we're going to look at the principle of depth, one of the principles of design covered in Chapter 4. And this particular principle is dealt with on page 120 of your text. Depth is related to the principle of figure ground, or what we perceive in the foreground or background of an image. And this technique is used very often to create interesting visual designs, especially when you want to draw attention to the main subject. You can do that a number of different ways. We're just going to look at a couple here. So let me bounce over to Photoshop, and here's a familiar image that you will see in figure 421 in Chapter 4. And it's an image of a dragonfly that was acquired photographically, and the dragonfly is brilliantly sharpened in focus, and the area directly in front of the dragonfly and directly behind the dragonfly begins to drop off in terms of its visual focus very quickly. And so what you end up having is attention given to the dragonfly, and the rest of the image, the leaf in the foreground and the leaves in the background, they're blurred by the photographer's lens. This creates a very interesting composition and certainly draws attention to the main subject of the photograph. Well, let's talk real quickly about how we can achieve this same effect within a design program like Photoshop by applying artificial effects or computer-generated effects to create foreground-background separation. So here's a composite image in which I've combined three elements. There's this really busy background full of lots of lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, all sorts of colors and so forth. And it's very, very busy. Matter of fact, I can just turn off these other objects to give you a better view of this. And it tends to compete. If you want to use something like this, you have to be very careful, because there's so much going on in this image that if you combine it with other elements within the design space, you could very quickly confuse the viewer and create something that just looks really like it was haphazardly thrown together. So again, if I bring in a foreground element, our little detective icon with the magnifying glass, and superimpose that over the top of the background, there's not a whole lot of depth that I can perceive as the viewer just by simply placing the foreground image over the background image. So we're going to see if we can improve that a little bit. And one of the things that I can do is I can take that tip from the photographer. Well, to achieve it here with the dragonfly image, the photographer created great depth of field by rolling off the background image, making it go out of focus and drawing attention to the foreground. So to do that in post-production with Photoshop, I'm going to select my sharp background, and I'm going to go up to filters in Photoshop, and I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur. It's under the blur tab, and if I scroll over, one of my blur options is this one here, which I like to use, called the Gaussian Blur. And I'm going to select that. It will pull up a little properties window that will allow me to manipulate the amount of blur I want to apply. And by adjusting the slider to the left, I can create less blur. By moving the slider to the right, I can create a lot of blur. So I'm going to strive to sort of acquire the middle ground here. I want some blurring, some separation, and that'll be good. And just by applying that one effect, I've instantly created clear foreground-background separation between the foreground subject and the background chaotic sort of mishmash of lines and colors. Alright, well, cool. So now let's add another element. I'm going to go ahead and turn on this foreground element here. This is the word depth in large big letters, impact, 175 point font. And even though it's really large, I purposely chose a color that is from the background, and so the word depth is just not popping. It looks flat against the background. There's very, very little that I can use to distinguish foreground background separation. So I've already done this. I'm going to turn on the effects, and what I've done is I've applied a drop shadow and I've applied a stroke to punch out the text in the foreground. And the way that I did this in Photoshop is I double-clicked on the depth element, open up my Layer Styles property window, and this gives me all sorts of effects that we can choose: bevel and emboss, stroke, inner shadow, and so forth. And some of the ones that I use most often are the drop shadow In this particular case, I also applied a stroke. So what you're seeing in terms of this edge that goes around the lettering, that's called a stroke. And the dark area that's dropping off to the right and down to the bottom of the screen, that is a drop shadow. It's to simulate light hitting the text from an angle and creating a cast shadow on the background, which in our perception makes it seem as though the text is floating above the surface of the background. We know, of course, that it's not. It's simply an illusion, but it does create that sense of depth. So let me go into the drop shadow properties and again manipulate it just by sliding these control sliders back and forth until I acquire the effect that I want. So depth is a wonderful tool at our disposal for allowing us to separate the background and foreground areas of a composite image. And I did the same thing earlier as well to the detective icon. So if I select that and turn the drop shadow property back on, you can see here too the ability to punch that out a little bit is enhanced. And you know, I'm kind of using exaggerated effects here just because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. But typically when you apply these effects, the principle of less is more is a good principle to go by. But again, what we had in the beginning was a very flat image, very little separation between the foreground and background objects within the composite, and by applying drop shadow and by applying a blur to the background of the image, I was able to create that photographic depth of field within the post-production editing environment of Photoshop.